The difference between the 60s and now is the draft. The country as a whole had a much more of a shared conscience than there is now.
W-O-R-K.
The 60s made room for outsiders and their ideas.
We were pushed on by history.
What a time to live in. It was very exciting, and the drug culture was just neat.
There was a rumor that they were going to put LSD in the water.
I think 1968 was probably the worst year in this nation's history.
And I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there.
I reached up and got my hand on the gun.
Now there is the violence of affluent whites.
Everything we knew had come apart.
They were an incredibly spoiled, self-indulgent generation.
By any measure, 1968 was a historic year. Powerful forces were unleashed. There were race riots and assassination, Vietnam, and a trip around the moon. The people who lived through that time have stories to tell that help us understand the country that we are today. 40 years ago, I stood on this corner in San Francisco. It was the center of the universe for the counterculture, hippies from around the world. I was trying to make sense of that turbulent year. It was a pivotal time, but it didn't happen overnight. And to understand 68, you have to know what came before it.
This is Tom Brokaw reporting from the Haight-Ashbury district in San Francisco.
The torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans.
It appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route.
The shots that killed President Kennedy were an explosive beginning for a decade of violent upheaval. Old rules were being discarded.
Turn on, tune in, drop out.
And rebellion was now a birthright.
I'm not going to have to bring up my children to do things that I was brought up to do.
The generation gap was growing wider and wider.
Their conduct, their actions is vulgar. Worse than vulgar. They're not human beings, they're animals, a lot of them.
The establishment was mocked.
Plastics.
Black power was embraced.
We're going to shoot the cops who are shooting our black brothers in the back in this country.
And at the heart of the turmoil, the war in Vietnam.
We face more cost, more loss, and more agony.
It was all leading to 1968.
In 1968 was the culmination of a sexual, civil rights, anti-war revolution in America.
It was a lot of fun. That scene was for young people. It was what we wanted to do, dancing, drinking. Thank God there was no cocaine around.
I can't think of a year in American history that was more divisive.
The year was barely a month old when the North Vietnamese launched an audacious attack on major cities in South Vietnam. The battle, known as the Tet Offensive, even penetrated the grounds of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon.
CIA men and MPs have gone into the embassy and are trying to get the snipers out by themselves.
The pictures on the television of street fighting in and around the U.S. Embassy, the idea that the military was calling
for another 200,000 people on top of 500,000. The sense that we were in this for a good long while, it certainly did suggest that there was not light at the end of the tunnel.
This was a horrendous event. It lasted for 3 weeks. You had the assault on the American embassy, and it seemed to contradict everything we had been told about how well things were going.
It seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate.
CBS News anchor Walter Cronkite went to Vietnam during the Tet Offensive to see the situation for himself.
3 weeks after the offensive began, the firing still goes on.
When he concluded the war was unwinnable, President Lyndon Johnson reportedly lamented, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." But not all of Middle America had abandoned the president and the war. Faces familiar today, such as Senators John McCain, Chuck Hagel, and Jim Webb, were proudly serving their country, and all across America, citizens felt the call to join up. Even if they didn't feel the call came to them in the form of a draft notice. Singer-songwriter Arlo Guthrie mocked his experience in front of the draft board in his popular anti-war song, Alice's Restaurant.
And he said, "Kid, I want you to go over and sit down on that bench that says Group W. Now, kid, you can get anything you want at Alice's Restaurant.
You can get anything you want at Alice's Restaurant. Walk right in, it's around the back, just a half a mile from the railroad track. And you can get anything you want at Alice's Restaurant." Well, it goes on for about another 18 minutes or so, talking about all kinds of things.
What did you think about Vietnam?
The rationale was that if we don't stop them over in Vietnam, those commies are going to be in New Jersey in just a couple of weeks. And I thought, if they can find their way around New Jersey, more power to them, because I couldn't find my way through the freaking state.
In 1968, another young musician, an 18-year-old from New Jersey, as a matter of fact, had also recently registered for the draft. Were you ever conflicted about Vietnam in terms of whether you would go or not?
No, because I came of age after the Tet Offensive. And I had had friends who'd gone and were killed. So that enormous, thundering tragedy, you know, was something where I didn't have any second thoughts about it.
After Springsteen failed his draft physical, he continued to pursue his musical career. And like many people his age, he found himself challenging his conservative small-town upbringing to a point.
There were 2 trains running on 1 track. I was a part of the culture and consciousness raising, both political and personal, of the 60s. But I never did any drugs. You know, I was sort of what you might call a faux hippie, you know. And I always had one leg that remained deeply rooted in my little town. I mean, you know, I'm the guy that wrote Born to Run and never really left New Jersey, except for a short period of time.
During this time, I was covering the war on the home front from the NBC News Bureau in Los Angeles.
American infantrymen cut their way through dense jungles today to crush Viet Cong sanctuaries about 25 miles north of Saigon and within rocket range of Bien Hoa.
In 1962, when I graduated from college, the draft was on, but no one was resisting. We all wanted to serve. I tried to get into a Navy officer program, but I was rejected by the Navy and the Army because I had flat feet. Then Vietnam came along. My brother was a Marine there, and I had a very close friend who wanted to join up. Gene Kimmel had a daredevil quality about him. When he graduated from college, he asked me if I knew any Marine recruiters who might be sympathetic to his desire to fly and might overlook his bum knee. It turned out I did. Gene was a natural as a Marine fighter pilot, and he was excited to ship out to Vietnam. In his letters home, he would share his changing impressions of the war. Meanwhile, the anti-war movement was exploding. College campuses across the country erupted in protest.
It was common currency among my fellow students that the President of the United States was not telling us the truth about Vietnam.
Jeffrey House was an undergraduate at the University of Wisconsin, a hotbed of student protest. Students planted crosses on campus to represent the graduating class of 1968 and worried what would happen once their draft deferments ran out.
Every day you would go down to the common room and the talk would be how to fake a medical condition to get out of the draft. And we were told you could roll peanut butter up in balls and put it in your stomach and it would appear like an ulcer.
If Jeffrey House was suspicious of the government rationale for the war, Nellie Harness, a 22-year-old Army nurse in Fort Hood, Texas, was a believer.
The Tet Offensive broke out, and I actually volunteered to go to Vietnam. I felt that it was my place to do something to support the war effort.
Just 2 months later, Nellie was on the front lines in Vietnam, stationed in a surgical hospital, treating both soldiers and civilians. The reality of the war was soon brought home to the idealistic young nurse. Tell me about a soldier named Burns.
Richard Burns. When I arrived up in triage, there were a number of people working on this very young soldier. And I walked over to see what else I could do to help. They just pronounced him dead at that point. And I was standing next to him, and one of the things we never did as medical personnel was to read the name tag of the soldier coming in, because you didn't want to personalize that soldier. But I did that. I looked at his name tag and I either stroked his face or stroked his arm, and I looked at him and I thought, his mother doesn't even know her son is dead. And it was like the war just sort of washed down over me.
After serving a year in Vietnam, Nellie left the war zone to work at Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, D.C. She was back in the U.S., but Vietnam would continue to haunt her for years to come, as it would haunt so many lives in 1968, including my own.
There is one hell of a lot of difference in fighting in the ring and going to war in Vietnam.
In 1968, the former heavyweight champion of the world, Muhammad Ali, asked the Supreme Court to void his conviction for draft evasion. A young running back from the University of Southern California named O.J. Simpson won the Heisman Trophy. And the New York Jets, led by a cocky quarterback named Broadway Joe Namath, turned the football establishment on its head by winning the American Football League championship and later becoming the first AFL team to win the Super Bowl. It wasn't just the sports world that was turning upside down. The whole culture was changing, most dramatically of all, the music.
There was just a burst of electricity and creativity that surrounded the music, as well as everything else that was really part of that new culture. It was like being in a different world.
What music do you still hear in your own mind from the 60s?
Everything. I can quote you anything. It's in my body. It's in my soul. It will never leave. When you go out and see us, you'll hear the Byrds, you'll hear the Beach Boys, you'll hear the Animals. Those are groups that moved me to live.
It's just an amazingly active time and a time of infinite possibilities.
James Taylor released his first album in 1968 on the Beatles' new record label, Apple. What came first? All the change or the music that was so much a part of that change? Here you were, Paul Simon, Neil Young, the Beatles, Bob Dylan certainly, writing the stories of your life. And everybody was responding to them in the most enthusiastic way.
You know, I think it was a product of the change, but it also communicated it to a lot of people and made a lot more people feel connected to this new thing, as if our generation was going to choose its own path.
But many members of that generation found themselves on a path that led straight to Vietnam.
I'd like to say hi to Mom back there at home. I know she's worried about me. I had no mail or resupply. So, to Mama back there in Greenfield, Tennessee, hello, Mama.
Lost any men here?
Well, I've got 6 people I've had wounded.
Yeah, you gotta be an idiot not to worry.
"1968 was the bloodiest year in the Vietnam War. 16,500 U.S. servicemen died, almost twice as many as the previous year. In the spring of '68, a varsity hockey star named Tom Coakley was graduating from college. He joined the Army, and just a few months after arriving in Vietnam, his platoon was hot on the trail of enemy soldiers.
Third squad, let's go!
We reached a point where we thought this would be a good place to set up an ambush.
But it was a trap. The hunter had become the hunted.
I remember just hearing this deafening blast. I looked down at my legs. The boot had been blown away. There was absolutely no question in my mind that I wouldn't have that leg.
Doctors had to amputate Tom's left leg below the knee. He returned stateside to Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, D.C., where the young nurse in charge of the ward immediately caught his eye. Remember the first time you saw Nellie?
I do. It was the very first day I arrived here.
Tom was very optimistic. I never saw Tom feeling sorry for himself.
As Tom slowly healed, nurse and patient developed a friendship that later blossomed into a romance. They married, started a family in upstate New York, and tried to forget about the war, but they couldn't.
I realized that there was a lot buried inside of me about Vietnam.
This is Nellie Coakley, who was at this.
I was an Army nurse. I served in Vietnam, and I was in charge of orthopedics at Walter Reed.
And this is her husband, Tom, who lost a leg in Vietnam.
Precisely where you were 30 years ago or so, maybe a couple more years ago.
Our society doesn't want to look at the suffering incurred by those who go to war. That was very difficult for me back then. Coming back here now is, I think, a similar connection.
Tom and Nellie have found that the best way to make peace with the horrors of that war is to help veterans of this one. Nellie is a trauma counselor, working with soldiers returning from America's current wars. Tom works with amputees.
We have to come back to society and say, look, this is perfectly okay, I'm doing fine, and you better start doing fine too. We have to take the lead in that role.
During Vietnam, the pain of war was made all too real to me when my friend Gene Kimmel suffered serious burns when the jet fighter refueling next to his plane suddenly burst into flames. When I met with him after his recovery, I tried to talk him out of returning for a second tour, but he wouldn't hear of it. As determined as Gene was to return, others were going the other way.
The war is political in the way it's being run, and that it is immoral.
Thousands of young men dodged the draft by moving to Canada.
There's certain things I won't do that I can't do.
Do you feel that you're running out on your country?
Robert said that America has gotten so far warped that she's run out on herself.
When University of Wisconsin student Jeffrey House was drafted, he decided that he would go to Canada and not to Vietnam.
I was certain that it was criminal in nature and something that no moral person should do, and so I decided that I wouldn't do it.
House became a Canadian citizen. Today, he's a successful Toronto attorney.
How are you, buddy?
Good. His decision to leave his country rather than fight overseas has not faded into the past. He recently took on the cases of U.S. service members seeking asylum in Canada to avoid being sent back to Iraq. One of them is Army Sergeant Phil McDowell.
I believed what they were saying about these stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction. I believed their justifications for the war. And then I went to war. And I saw that they had sent me and hundreds of thousands of other people there because of a lie.
It so reminded me of how we felt. How could it be that they would lie to us and then demand that we give our lives for a lie?
Jeffrey House has met with almost 200 American soldiers and Marines and believes there are at least 100 others who have fled across the border into Canada.
It does bother me that I can't go back, but I do know that I made the right choice.
In October 1968, I received some heartbreaking news. My friend, Marine Captain Gene Kimmel, was killed on a combat flight over a Vietnamese battlefield. He was just 30 years old. At his funeral here in South Dakota, I burst into tears and said something about this damn war. But my emotion was tempered by the muted grief of his wife and parents. Their mixed feelings of pride and bewilderment over the loss of this singular young man. I remember thinking, not for the first time that year, that I was living in so many Americas. This one, where the casualties of a controversial war were honored and mourned. And in my new home in California, where the anti-war resistance and rebellion was fueling a massive cultural change.
I remember going to love-ins. That was the whole point, was to be at the extreme opposite of terror of war, surrounded by beautiful people with flowers in their hair.
It was a whole new game. A lot of people were stepping away from the old models. We're not going to live with any of these assumptions that we've lived with forever, that our folks lived with. We're going to change all that.
Some people tried to change the way they were living entirely, moving away from the cities into self-sustaining groups called communes, where they shared food supplies, living space, and even sexual partners.
We're starting to work with geodesic shapes. We think that's good, that people have been living inside of squares for too many years. We'd like to get inside of a circle.
In 1968, a free thinker named Stuart Brand created a how-to book for communal living called The Whole Earth Catalog. Instantly, it sold millions of copies.
I just wanted to do something to help out my friends in communes who were flying out of the cities and out of the universities to these country places to try to reinvent civilization.
Brand was also a member of author Ken Kesey's Merry Pranksters, a hippie group that delighted in using drugs and doing pretty much anything that would challenge convention. They made their base in San Francisco.
With drugs and communal activities and sex and every other thing you could imagine, we were trying to see if there was an edge and just keep going until you fell off something, and that might be the edge, but it might not. There might be more.
Haight and Ashbury. It's an intersection in a working-class neighborhood in San Francisco. But in the 1960s, of course, this was the crossroads of the hippie movement. I came here as a young reporter for NBC News in 1967. The streets were jammed with hippies and wannabe hippies from all over the world. Tie-dye shirts and love beads, playing bongos, smoking dope openly. I was dressed in a button-down shirt, a narrow tie, and a suit. In this crowd, I was the freak.
San Francisco is where LSD was first marketed, where it is most readily and cheaply available.
I had a very good relationship with drugs. I used them. I had fun with them. I grew with them.
San Francisco is estimated also to smoke a ton of marijuana each week.
Comedian Louis Black was a 19-year-old college student in 1968.
One of the things about the 60s, if it felt good, I pretty much did it. I've got to say, we gave it a shot.
Donnie and Chuck and White Eyes told their parents in Dallas they were coming here to play in a band. They came for acid and pot.
It gave me an idea of where my spiritual side was until I used certain hallucinogens. The spiritual side of me was non-existent.
In those days, it seemed a little more healthy to be smoking weeds
instead of getting involved with some of the, what we thought was even more awful, which was whiskey and stuff like that. Of course, I've changed my mind on some of these things over the years, but in the early days...
Well, how did you change your mind?
Oh, I've grown to like whiskey.
At the heart of the Haight-Ashbury scene was a free health clinic run by a young doctor named David Smith.
The hippies aren't interested in any philosophy, including communism. They just want to live the way they want to live without structural bindings.
Today, Dr. Smith still lives in Haight-Ashbury.
They'd come to make love, not war, and they'd get gonorrhea, and they'd take LSD in the park and freak out, and we were the cleaners. We were the ones that took care of things.
Hey, baby, come on. You want to wake up? What happened? You went on a bummer? All right.
I had to take care of some woman who was on a bummer.
Oh, you took care of some woman, and that's why you're crashing now?
Now, this is the Grateful Dead house here.
We would all like to be able to live an uncluttered life, a simple life, a good life, you know, and like think about moving the whole human race ahead a step.
The Haight was home to many popular musicians, including Jefferson Airplane and Janis Joplin, and her band, Big Brother and the Holding Company.
She actually came to our clinic, Janis Joplin, and she's a wonderful woman, great musician.
Joplin sang at a benefit concert that saved the clinic when it ran out of money. Later, Smith thanked her at a local restaurant.
I said, well, how come you're not over there eating dinner with Big Brother? She says, I drink my dinner. In the 60s, it was more drug switching. So what Janis did was she switched from Southern Comfort to heroin. Then we resuscitated a couple of her heroin overdoses with Narcan. So then she'd detox on Southern Comfort.
Now, a lot of the musicians and the people around the fringes of that said, yeah, but you know, drugs made them better artists, that it liberated them.
I can just list all the talent that was destroyed because of drugs. Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, Jim Morrison. I just don't buy that.
Of course, not everyone was a recreational drug user or a hippie in 1968. The majority were average Americans with families and jobs and everyday routines. But the rebellious spirit of the counterculture did seep into their homes every Sunday night, when more than 20 million Americans tuned in to watch the Smothers Brothers' provocative variety show. They used satirical humor to ridicule the politicians. In this skit, Tommy insists that Americans can tell who's running the country by the amount of clothes that they wear.
Some people can afford more clothes on and other people less clothes on?
That's right, exactly. See, some people, the ordinary people, are the less-ons, see?
Uh-huh. They're the less-ons. Well, who's running the country?
The moron.
It takes courage, but when you're doing something, you don't feel like it's courage.
Every show was more controversial than the last one, and the television network bosses began cutting out more and more material. Viewers tuned in every week, not knowing if the Smothers Brothers would even be allowed to be on the air again. In the early months of 1968, the average salary for baseball players was roughly $20,000 a year. Peggy Fleming won a gold medal at the Winter Olympics. And on television, the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour was in its second season. Week after week, the Smothers Brothers used satire to lampoon the big events of American life, particularly the war in Vietnam.
Our government is asking us as citizens, good citizens, to refrain from traveling to foreign lands.
Okay, all you guys in Vietnam, come on home.
The audience loved it, but the network censors did not. They ordered the two comedians to tone down their sarcasm or risk having skits and songs and even the whole program canceled.
And if they hadn't said, you can't say that, I might have let it go. But don't ever tell a comedian, you can't do that, because they will do that.
So it was a bargaining game that was going on a lot of
It
this.
was a bargaining game, and it was always respectful. It was never with bad language or anything like that. It was the only show in the air doing it.
The Smothers Brothers show would have a major, if unintended, impact on a young boy in New Jersey who would grow up and use his own brand of humor to challenge the establishment. How much of what you're able to do you think is the result of the work of people like Tommy and Dickie Smothers?
I think if I was going to trace my genealogy, if I look down the tree, that's for me where it ends.
You're a powerful and influential voice now.
Hugely influential and powerful. As you see, all of my prescriptions for society have come true.
As you know, if you are a minority or an interest group, the Democrats will hold the debate at your house. Whereas Republicans take a slightly different approach. They have a big tent, you're just not allowed in it.
He comes on at the end of the day, and he pulls the veil off all the things that you've been seeing and hearing, and he lays it out for you.
The audience for Stewart's Daily Show is young, hip, and politically engaged, much like the audience for the Smothers Brothers. Your audience is much smaller than their audience was and what they were expected to deliver at that time.
And yet physically fatter. So really, I think if it were a tug of war,
you might win.
It'd be close. 1.4 million today versus the 30 million back then. You know, they didn't have trans fat. We do.
Stewart and Smothers believe Americans are getting a sanitized view today of the war in Iraq.
There was a real sense of covering the Vietnam War. They covered it. Iraq is not being covered. There's more misinformation given on the broadest spectrum than there ever was back then because we didn't have that many things. Yeah.
Think of the images that came from Vietnam and the visceral nature of them, and think of the images of Iraq. I mean, I think
we don't see
the president talks about people see this on TV. I kind of think we don't. I don't think we have any idea of what reality is on the ground there and what our guys are going through and what the people of Iraq are going through.
Those images from Vietnam, which Americans did see, were a call to action on the home front. The search began for an anti-war candidate to challenge President Johnson. So a nationwide student movement turned to Senator Eugene McCarthy. Sam Brown was one of the student leaders.
People were more enthusiastic about him than he was about people. We found the candidate. It turned out to be an articulate, intelligent, thoughtful candidate, but not a table thumper and certainly no great public orator.
Brown encouraged his fellow students, some of whom had long hair and hippie clothing, to become clean for Gene.
Save the party, join McCarthy, make the scene with Gene.
The volunteers were serious about their work.
Volunteers for Senator McCarthy. Yeah. We're reminding everybody to vote in the primary.
Although Brown, for one, could see the appeal of the sex, drugs, and rock and roll spirit of the day.
Was a kind of openness and freedom about it. I mean, you know, you're in your 20s. What isn't appealing about lots of very attractive young women wandering around in various stages of dress? This is a good idea.
In the New Hampshire Democratic primary, McCarthy ambushed the party establishment by coming within 8 points of defeating the country's leading Democrat, a sitting president.
It is a surprise, and that it changes the political picture in America for 1968. Now, that's the best thing.
I think they deeply, grossly underestimated the opposition to the war. Grossly underestimated. And it was, in many ways, that underestimation and that sort of arrogance that finally became their undoing in New Hampshire.
Senator Robert Kennedy brought his presidential campaign to Southern California today.
Right after the New Hampshire primary, Senator Robert Kennedy joined the race, adding his voice in opposition to the war.
How many more men, how many more lives, how much more destruction will be asked to provide the military victory that is always just around the corner?
Kennedy also used his campaign to champion the efforts of Cesar Chavez, who was organizing farm workers struggling to get out of poverty. Dolores Huerta, who worked with Chavez, urged Latinos and blacks to vote for Kennedy.
He was someone that we really looked up to because, you know, he kind of stretched out his hand to help you. It was like, what can I do to help?
That spring, Planet of the Apes and 2001: A Space Odyssey were on the big screen. But not even Hollywood could have scripted the surprising conclusion of President Johnson's speech to the nation at the end of March.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
The campaign ricocheted from one surprise to another. Less than a month after Johnson dropped out, Vice President Hubert Humphrey joined the race, maintaining his support for the war.
The struggle for peace is not for the weak or the cowardly or the timid. The struggle for peace is for the brave and the strong.
And no one could have imagined that former Vice President Richard Nixon, who had written his own political obituary, would resurrect his career and suddenly move to the inside track for the Republican nomination.
But if I were to pick a time in the whole history of man in which to live and a place in which to live, I'd pick the United States of America, 1968. This is the place, this is the time, and never forget it.
Nixon appealed to what would later be called the silent majority, those voters who were fed up with the growing social unrest in the country. Writer Dorothy Rabinowitz was among them.
Most of the time, it was a wild excess of self-glorification and narcissism and strangeness and a lot of destroyed drug culture lives.
Meanwhile, former Alabama Governor George Wallace entered the race as an independent candidate. Wallace was a populist firebrand who tapped into the deep-seated anger of white, blue-collar voters who loved his red meat rhetoric and the way he fired back at his critics.
Well, why don't you learn some other four-letter words, like W-R-K and S-O-A-P? You ought to learn those. You don't know those.
He brought out the worst in people by appealing to their racial prejudices. A Wallace aide named Tom Turnipseed recalls talking to a club manager in Massachusetts who had agreed to host a rally for Wallace.
I was having a beer with him, and he started talking about black people, and he says, now, when Governor Wallace is elected president, he's going to line up, and I'm just going to quote you him. He's going to line up all these and kill them, isn't he?
The growing racial tension in America in 1968 would soon explode in a small town in South Carolina. Lives would be lost, and the resulting scars would remain 40 years later.
No justice, no peace! No justice, no peace! We're here, black people, we're here to make a statement!
Gina, Louisiana, September 2007. Thousands take to the streets after a fight between black and white high school students exposes the still festering wounds of racial conflict.
I'm black and I'm proud!
The echoes of an earlier time are unmistakable.
We are tired of being beaten. We are tired of being murdered. We are tired of being shot down.
In 1968, race relations in America were complicated and volatile.
I grew up in integrated neighborhoods. I experienced the race rioting up close and personal in 2 towns that I lived in. I had black friends. I had black friends that wouldn't speak to me when race issues really heated up in my little town of Freehold, you know.
The total, irrevocable destruction of this blood-sucking system.
1968 was the year ex-con and Black Power revolutionary Eldridge Cleaver openly challenged the establishment in his best-selling memoir, Soul on Ice. And Hollywood took on race on the big screen. Sidney Poitier co-starred in 2 of the biggest movies honored at that year's Academy Awards. In the Heat of the Night won the Best Picture Oscar for its story about race in the Deep South. And Katharine Hepburn won an Oscar for her role in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, a film about interracial relationships set in the world of upper-class whites. America was changing, slowly.
And I come to ask you to go all out to get every Negro in this county registered to vote, to see what a power you can be.
First meeting with Dr. King was at Talladega College in 1957.
Andrew Young was among the young aides who were never far from Martin Luther King during the civil rights years. Did you think your children would have the lives that they have now?
Well, I really thought my children would have the lives that they have now. I knew we would be successful. We were simply being held back by color barriers. We broke down those color barriers, so they've got to succeed.
My name is Bakari Sellers, and I am...
Bakari Sellers is a living example of what the civil rights generation hoped to make possible. In 2006, at the age of 22, and while still in law school, Sellers was elected to the South Carolina House of Representatives.
It's a beautiful capital, it's a beautiful place to be. And I'm looking at all the pictures and looking at all the people who are kind of looking in, looking down on us, and just being proud. I felt like I made a lot of people happy. Hey, Cheryl, this is Representative Sellers. It's Miss Ann.
Few in Orangeburg, South Carolina would have believed Bakari Sellers' story possible back in 1968.
These are the things that happened during this particular period of time.
But for his father, Cleveland Sellers, Bakari's life is the dream he almost died for.
Our idealism told us that we could create a better world, and that better world would be for the next generation that came along.
Cleveland Sellers was a civil rights veteran who'd been schooled in Dr. King's nonviolence. But by 1968, like many young activists, Sellers was becoming more militant. The old freedom songs gave way to a defiant chant, Black Power.
We have something new that we can work with, something that's going to empower us, something that's going to deal with our image of ourselves. But now we didn't have any idea that the response to Black Power was going to be what it was.
The words hit whites like a thunderbolt. Black Power sounded raw and threatening.
Black is beautiful, free
So in early February, when black students from South Carolina State clashed with Orangeburg police while trying to desegregate the town's only bowling alley, authorities had Black Power ringing in their ears and Cleveland Sellers in their sights.
It became very obvious to me that the way it was being set up, I was going to be the fall guy, irregardless of what it was.
Over the next few days, the confrontation heated up, reaching the boiling point on the night of February 8th, while students staged a bonfire rally. As local police and state troopers backed up by National Guardsmen ringed the campus, someone threw something. A police officer was hit in the face. The night ignited.
I think it was 8 seconds, but it sounded like it was about 24 years. I mean, it was just loud, just boom, bam, bop. And so the inclination was to drop down to the ground. When I was going down, I felt my body twist as I got shot in the left shoulder.
When the smoke cleared, there were 3 dead and 27 wounded. The incident would become known as the Orangeburg Massacre, and it marked a new and deadly phase for student protest. Just as he feared, Cleveland Sellers was arrested. Convicted on flimsy evidence, he was sentenced to 1 year of hard labor.
The absurdity of it all was just overwhelming. We talked about the movement, starting out focused around the issue of race.
Today, Cleveland Sellers teaches the history he lived and the lessons he learned at the University of South Carolina. For the father, Black Power was an empowering slogan.
Amen.
For the son, Black Power means constituent services. Still, Bakari Sellers says the passions of 1968 are what drives him today.
I have come to the conclusion that I am way more bitter about 1968 than my father is now. I think that it's kind of good myself because it keeps me focused, it keeps me on the path to create change, it keeps me hopefully carrying the torch of my father, but also the other 26 that were wounded and the 3 who were killed.
Shortly after the Orangeburg Massacre, Martin Luther King met with his closest advisors on the eve of a trip to Memphis, Tennessee. Bakari Sellers had not been born yet, but King imagined a time when politicians, such as Bakari, could make a difference.
He said we ought not have to march and go to jail every time there's an issue. We ought to be able to elect people of goodwill, regardless of race,
to stand up for justice and do what's right and just live out the Constitution.
Dr. King was headed for Memphis to support sanitation workers who were striking for better wages and working conditions. When Dr. King got there, how worried were you about his safety personally?
Not at all. Not at all. And that's a mistake. He was not worried about his safety.
In April 1968, Martin Luther King arrived in Memphis to speak at a local church.
Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now.
The country's history was about to take another tragic turn. It was just before 6 o'clock on April 4th, 1968, when Dr. Martin Luther King stepped outside his second-floor room at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis to chat with friends in the parking lot below.
NBC interrupts its regular program schedule to bring you the following special report.
Martin Luther King Jr. was killed tonight in Memphis, Tennessee.
The bullet exploded in his face, and evidently it came from this direction.
I knew he was dead immediately. I mean, the bullet went through the tip of his jaw and took half of his neck, and so you could see his spinal cord.
That took place about 3 or 4 days after Lyndon Johnson dropped out, and it was a horrible event.
These kinds of events made you wonder what the heck is going on here.
Violence dishonors him, for he sought the redemption of men, not violence.
We couldn't cry, we couldn't grieve. The one thing that we learned in the movement was that when anybody struck down, the important thing to do is to continue whatever it was they were giving their life to, so that their life would not be given in vain.
Awaiting trial on the Orangeburg riot charges, Cleveland Sellers arrived in Washington just a few hours after the news of King's assassination broke. Parts of the capital city were already on fire.
It was deep-seated anger.
You had troops coming in and around the White House.
Here we have Dr. King, who is talking about peaceful change, and he's assassinated. And that was just anger.
Riots went on for days and days.
The eruption of violence and arson that followed Dr. King's assassination would engulf black neighborhoods in more than 100 cities, but not Indianapolis.
Do they know about Martin Luther King?
That night is one of the seminal moments in American political drama. It's when Robert Kennedy went to a ghetto in Indianapolis, told this crowd that King had been killed.
Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis.
In 1968, Jeff Greenfield was a young Kennedy staffer and a speechwriter.
He talked about what we need is not hatred and division, we need compassion and we need justice. Talked about his brother's death, I think the only time he ever did that.
For those of you who are black and are tempted to be filled with hatred and mistrust of the injustice of such an act against all white people, I would only say that I can also feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man.
Watching the riots spread through Harlem that night was a young Columbia University student who had just returned from Cuba.
I do sympathize with the Cuban Revolution.
His name, Mark Rudd, and in 1968, he believed he could kickstart a student revolution at Columbia that would stop the war in Vietnam.
Now this is clearly a political activity, a political action on the part of the...
That spring, Mark Rudd became the face of campus radicalism in America. Is this an out-of-body experience for you to stand here and look over what is now a very placid campus with a student body that is focused mostly on going out and making a killing on Wall Street?
I think I've probably had 40 years to adjust to the concept. It's not exactly an out-of-body experience. It actually is a strange experience because the last time I was on this very spot, the campus was entirely on strike, closed down. And I was standing up here and the Grateful Dead was playing a benefit down below.
The student strikes that Mark Rudd led began as youthful rebellion against a university plan to expand its campus into a black neighborhood.
To say no gym in Columbia, no gym in Morningside Park.
But when students learned university researchers were working with defense contractors in support of the war, their movement mushroomed.
Our goal was growing the peace movement, basically. We called it radicalization. But what it meant was getting more and more people to understand the nature of the war and to stand up against it.
By the end of April, Rudd's revolt had grown from a few dozen hardcore activists to more than 1,000.
Black Columbia students are in complete control of Hamilton Hall.
The Strike Coordinating Committee reiterates that our 6 demands must be met.
Well, they're not going to get amnesty.
You're just breaking the strike, man. Break the strike.
Watching with interest was a young speechwriter on Nixon's campaign staff, Pat Buchanan.
I wrote a statement denouncing these overprivileged kids for what they were doing. 95% of the American people in the poll said they agreed with denouncing the kids at Columbia. Let me tell you, they didn't have any support in Middle America.
For 1 week, everything at Columbia University stopped. Then the administration called the New York City Police Department. It was a bloody affair. The Vietnam War, it seemed, was being fought on 2 fronts. More than 700 students were arrested, but the uprising at Columbia inspired similar protests on other campuses. You think you were responsible for ending the war?
I think that students, as a part of a much larger anti-war movement, were definitely responsible.
Now, 40 years later, do you think you could rally another kind of movement against what you call the American empire?
I doubt it. I think movements create leaders rather than leaders create movements.
After the Columbia University uprising, Rudd became even more radical.
You've heard of the troubled 60s? Well, the troubled 60s give rise to the violent 70s.
He co-founded the Weather Underground, a group dedicated to change through violence if necessary. But he has since rejected many of his old ideas.
We thought we were going to build some kind of revolutionary army. I thought that there was such a thing as a just revolutionary war. I think I was wrong.
They're bombing Baghdad by the hour. What do we do? We fight the powers!
March on Washington and the war?
Anti-war feelings still exist at Columbia today.
March on Washington this Saturday, so we're going to have...
But it pales in comparison to the passionate fury that was so prevalent on campuses in 1968.
If there was a draft, man, this would be a whole different game. And they know that, and that's why there's no draft.
There are students who sort of wish they had been in the 60s.
Prize-winning historian Alan Brinkley is provost at Columbia today, and the son of my good friend and mentor, the late David Brinkley.
We're a much more conservative country today than we were in the 60s, and that's because of the 60s to a significant degree.
The left went too far, excessive in its behavior on a daily basis?
Well, there were excesses on the left, needless to say.
Campus radicals, such as Mark Rudd, simply infuriated many Americans, some of whom also took to the streets to protest the protesters. Although the term values voters was not yet part of our vocabulary in 1968, the culture wars that divide and define America today were already well underway.
The communists never miss an opportunity to blacken the name of police and law enforcement everywhere.
Still, the counterculture was rapidly becoming the popular culture. Even Broadway capitalized on hippie chic with its hit rock musical, Hair. In the late spring of 1968, I was covering the big political showdown between Senators McCarthy and Kennedy in the important California primary. I had friends in both camps.
I loved Robert Kennedy. I loved what he said, I loved what he did, and I was proud to be with him.
Rafer Johnson, a gold medal decathlon champion at the 1960 Olympics, was a colleague of mine in 1968 at KNBC in Los Angeles.
The Los Angeles Kings, before 11,200 fans at the Forum,
He had a promising career in broadcasting ahead of him, but he gave it up to work for Robert Kennedy.
What was it about Bobby and that campaign that made it irresistible for you?
He was very much concerned and involved in, of course, in the civil rights movement, what was happening to people of color. He was deeply concerned about the men and women and families in poverty. And, of course, the Vietnam War was big.
So was the anti-war vote, but for that, Kennedy would have to fight. Eugene McCarthy had long been cultivating anti-war students, and the two men now found themselves in a heated rivalry.
I want us to work together.
Gene McCarthy used to boast, I have the A students, Bobby has the B students, which tells you something about Gene McCarthy's elitism.
After winning primaries in Indiana and Nebraska, Kennedy lost to McCarthy in Oregon. The next test was just a week away. On the first Tuesday in June, Kennedy and McCarthy would go head-to-head for the biggest prize of all, California. The voters would speak, but in the end, fate would have the final say. In June 1968, Rosemary's Baby was a box office hit. Avant-garde artist Andy Warhol was shot by an actress whom he had snubbed.
A new leadership will not risk more and more lives, American and Vietnamese alike, in the name of false pride.
And in California, the Kennedy and McCarthy campaigns were urging voters to turn out for what would be a decisive presidential primary.
It was very clear that either Robert Kennedy would win the California primary or he would withdraw from the race. He'd lost the Oregon primary the week before.
Kennedy took California by less than 5%. He celebrated that evening with his supporters and campaign aides, including Rafer Johnson.
It was an unbelievable high. I mean, he was on his way to the White House. And that's what we were all thinking, if not saying at that point.
To my old friend, if I may, to Rafer Johnson, who's here.
Kennedy credited blacks and Latinos for his margin of victory, and he thanked those who turned out the vote.
And Dolores Huerta, who's an old friend of mine and has worked with the union, to thank her and tell her how much I appreciate her coming tonight.
So much of the dreams, you know, the things that people were working for in the 60s were going to happen if Robert Kennedy was the president of the United States.
I want to first express my high regard to Don Drysdale.
I remember scribbling a note to give to Kennedy that Don Drysdale of the Dodgers had just broken some significant record, and he should definitely mention that at the, in the victory speech.
Who pitched his sixth straight shutout tonight. And I hope that we have as good fortune in our campaign. My thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there. Thank you, guys.
And as we were walking away, of course, we know that they took him into the kitchen. He was not supposed to go into the kitchen. We had a room with mariachis that was waiting for him with the farm workers that had done the precinct walking, and he was supposed to go with me to that room.
So you step in to the kitchen passageway, just thinking you're on your way to a car.
That's exactly it. I was 10, 15 feet behind the senator. And when I heard what I thought was balloon pops.
I thought they were firecrackers, but then we heard people screaming.
I reached up and got my hand on the gun.
Rafer Johnson has a hold of a man who apparently has fired the shot. Get the gun. Get the gun. Take a hold of his thumb and break it if you have to. Get his thumb.
The senator fell away.
Senator Kennedy has been shot. Please, everybody out. This is Dick.
Is there a doctor? Everybody, please stay back. Please stay back. We need a doctor here.
We were upstairs in the studio. The television was on, but the sound was off. And I remember my friend was staring at the television, and she put it together from what she was seeing without the sound. And I just remember her saying, "Oh my God, not again."
Kennedy was rushed to Good Samaritan Hospital. I raced there and waited with a crowd of other journalists, Kennedy supporters, and the merely curious, who gathered throughout the night and into the day, awaiting the news. I mean, all the cars pulled up and everybody went to emergency.
Exactly, yeah.
I think it might have been.
And I think it was right here. I think there was a circle.
Senator Robert Francis Kennedy died at 1:44 a.m. today, June 6, 1968.
When Frank Mankiewicz came out and said he's died.
That was a tough one. Yeah, that was a tough one. I don't even know what to compare with even today, Tom. I mean, a dream that we all had and had worked for so hard was not going to happen. And it was truly one of the saddest moments of my life.
Robert Kennedy's assassination, after the murders of his brother and Dr. King, seemed too much to take. Rafer Johnson, who had wrestled Kennedy's assassin to the floor that night, made a surprising discovery the next day.
I took the gun and put it in my pocket, a suit pocket. And the next morning got up and took the jacket up to hang it up, and the gun is still in my pocket.
Wow. Kennedy's body was taken to New York and then put on a funeral train for Washington, D.C. Jeff Greenfield was on board.
But every time you looked out the window and saw Cub Scouts with an American flag saluting, or World War II vets, or maybe older, with their caps saluting goodbye, or people in tears along the train, I can only speak for myself. That's when I lost it. Inside the train was one thing, but when you looked out, you understood what had taken place.
As he said many times in many parts of this nation, to those he touched and who sought to touch him. Some men see things as they are and say why. I dream things that never were and say why not.
People would get up in the morning and say, what's going to happen now? And children, it was noted at the time, didn't know that leaders actually died a natural death. They began to think everybody was assassinated. It was one of the dark, gothic, terrible jokes of the time.
After the assassination, Senator McCarthy suspended his campaign, and when he resumed, it was only half-heartedly.
It was weird. I remember at the time that Paul Simon song, the "Where have you gone, Joe DiMaggio? The nation turns its lonely." Well, where have you gone, Gene McCarthy? Just disappear.
As the Democrats tried to regroup, former Vice President Richard Nixon, the man who once insisted he was through with politics, was nominated as the Republican presidential candidate.
The choice we make in 1968 will determine not only the future of America, but the future of peace and freedom in the world for the last third of the 20th century.
Now it was time for the Democrats to gather for their convention in Chicago. But they would be joined by a few thousand uninvited guests. Radical Abby Hoffman among them.
Political pigs, your days are numbered. We are the second American Revolution. We are winning. Yippee!
It was late August, and the Windy City braced for a political hurricane. In the summer of 1968, Arthur Ashe became the first African-American man to win the U.S. Tennis Open. Denny McClain became the first major league pitcher in more than 3 decades to win 30 games. And Elvis Presley and his wife Priscilla were in the spotlight celebrating the birth of their first and only child, Lisa Marie. But a larger spotlight would fall on Chicago, where thousands of protesters converged for the Democratic National Convention. They intended to make their opposition to the war and politics as usual heard loud and clear.
Hell no, we won't go! Hell no, we won't go!
The city, which refused to grant any protest permits, resembled an armed camp. Thousands of police and National Guard troops were called in to prepare for possible violence.
Our intelligence unit said, you know, they're sort of here to disrupt the convention, and they're going to do what they have to do.
Chicago Police Detective Larry Evans was on one side of the barricades that week. Student protester Marilyn Katz was on the other. They still disagree today about what happened.
There was a rumor that they were going to put LSD in the water. And honest to God, police believe them.
You know, they were burning Park District benches for fuel.
Total urban myth.
Yes.
Total
No,
urban
I was there.
myth. No,
I was there,
Beth.
It wasn't long before protesters and police squared off. When a Viet Cong flag was planted atop a statue in Grant Park, the scene exploded.
You're a Korean War veteran, you come from a working class background. A lot of these are college kids from different backgrounds. How much did that work on you?
You have a sense of patriotism, country. When you see a Viet Cong flag, it irritates the hell out of you.
Inside the convention hall, tensions were high as security forces loyal to Chicago Mayor Daley tangled with reporters and delegates alike.
What are you trying to strong arm stuff? He's an elected delegate.
Any sense of decorum was lost.
The Chicago police are now in the aisles here with billy clubs clearing people out.
When news that delegates had rejected an anti-war platform reached the protesters outside, their anger reached a fever pitch. Despite violent clashes between police and protesters earlier in the week, McCarthy aide Sam Brown was hopeful that cooler heads could prevail.
The police are not going to attack a bunch of people sitting in the middle of the street in downtown Chicago. The television cameras are up there. The whole world is watching, for Pete's sake.
From the east side to the west side of the park, where the demonstrators were, this phalanx of tear gas-laden vehicles goes marching to the park.
The so-called daily dozers, these Jeeps with barbed wire mesh on the front of them to push people back.
Spewing tear gas ahead of it, blinding these kids who panic.
The police attack. There's windows breaking, tear gas every place.
They hit me, I went down, trying to fend off some of the blows. I came back up, in which case they hit me again, and hit me again. Puts them in at least a dozen of them.
The 18 minutes of violence was recorded by television cameras, and the unedited footage was broadcast around the world.
A girl being carried off to a paddy wagon in something less than a nonviolent manner.
A government commission would later call the confrontation a police riot.
This is directly in front of what advertises itself as the world's largest and friendliest hotel.
Marilyn Katz and Larry Evans disagree today about what happened. She admits creating balls of nails and staples to puncture the tires on police vehicles. He insists the police response to the protests was appropriate.
After this was all over that night, I went home, I had a bite to eat, and I went to bed. It was another day of police work.
Pretty violent scene over here in front of the Hilton, though. 18 minutes of mayhem, really.
Yeah, on both sides. It wasn't a one-way street.
On both sides. Let's see. You've got billy clubs, tear gas, guns. We didn't have anything.
Nothing, right?
Maybe somebody picked up whatever was on the floor. There were nobody.
People,
had,
my sergeant, John was hit in the face. He still has a scar.
Yeah.
Now somebody did that.
It was supposed to be a nonviolent demonstration today.
Pat Buchanan was in Chicago to monitor the proceedings for the Nixon campaign. He spoke frequently with Nixon himself throughout the week, describing the spreading confrontation, the growing anger towards Chicago Mayor Daley.
I remember him calling me up. He was late one night. "What's going on now?" I said, "You want to know what's going on, sir?" And I held the phone out the window, and they were yelling, "F you, Daley, F you, Daley." And I said, "That's what's going on."
The night after the violent confrontation in front of the Conrad Hilton Hotel, Michigan Avenue was cordoned off by military vehicles with concertina wire and young National Guardsmen with their weapons at the ready. The Guardsmen were the same age as the anti-war demonstrators, and as I walked between them and the protesters, I thought, this is the dividing line of America. The divisions outside the convention hall were reflected by the chaos inside. Criticism of Daley and his police force rained down from the podium.
We wouldn't have to have Gestapo tactics in the streets of Chicago.
Mayor Daley, visibly furious, responded with what some thought were obscenities. Against that backdrop of hostility, Vice President Humphrey secured the nomination and pleaded for unity.
I say to America, put aside recrimination and dissension. Turn away from violence and hatred.
But the damage had been done. The Democratic Party self-destructed on national television, and Hubert Humphrey left the convention a hobbled candidate.
1968 was a watershed where the Democratic Party that had formed under Roosevelt and sustained itself under Truman and Kennedy just became unstuck for good. That coalition, that particular coalition, was gone, and we're not going to see that one back.
At the end of the week, I went back to South Dakota to visit my working class dad, a longtime FDR Democrat, who was opposed to the war in Vietnam, but he was enraged by what he had seen on television that week, enraged by the behavior of the anti-war demonstrators, the way they had flown the Viet Cong flag and taunted the police. I knew then the Democratic Party was in real trouble. Post-convention polls showed Richard Nixon with a sizable lead over Humphrey and independent candidate George Wallace.
Well, Greg, aren't you having fun now, huh?
Trying to burnish his image as just a regular guy, Nixon agreed to appear on the #1 show in the country that fall, Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In.
Sock it to me?
As the campaign entered the fall, a new type of protest emerged. This time, it was women demanding their equal rights.
We were tired of making coffee and not policy. And out of that, the first cells of this wave of feminism began.
So they decided to disrupt one of the most time-honored traditions in America, one whose time, they said, was now past. By the fall of 1968, there were other stories to cover besides the war in Vietnam and the presidential campaign. John Lennon and Yoko Ono posed naked on the cover of their new album, Two Virgins. And during the Mexico City Olympics, 2 American medal winners, Tommy Smith and John Carlos, shocked the nation when they gave Black Power salutes during the national anthem.
I applaud those men, and I still see them periodically, and I'll stand up and applaud what they did then and the kinds of things they've done in between, because they are definitely great Americans.
Many Americans didn't think so. They also didn't know what to make of young women such as Robin Morgan, who were brash, radical, and preparing an assault on a bastion of American values. The Miss America pageant in Atlantic City.
We weren't calling ourselves feminists yet. We were afraid of the F word, as many women are today. We called ourselves women's liberationists.
Come on, boys, get out of the way there, will you?
Using tactics learned from anti-war activists, Morgan organized and led the kind of theatrical protest in Atlantic City that was a hallmark of the times.
We decided that we would rent a sheep, a ewe, E-W-E, and parade her as Miss America because Miss America, the contestants were treated like pieces of meat.
No more girdles, no more pain, no more trying to hold them flat in vain.
There was a freedom trash can for women to throw off symbols of oppression, such as high-heeled shoes, girdles, steno pads, and of course, their bras. The country was now on notice. A new generation of American women had come of age. It would not be satisfied until it had full equality with men. Women came from as far away as California, Florida, and Wisconsin to be a part of the protest, to write a new chapter in the history of women in America.
There were more middle-of-the-road groups, but the humor and the kind of wit and feistiness of the demonstration, I think, is what caught fire.
What I thought of it personally was that its leaders did it no good. The extremist leaders who went around, of course they didn't really burn their bras, but they did what radicals do. They made fools of what should have been a sober and serious enterprise.
For many, watching the women's movement unfold on their television screens, it seemed as if the entire social fabric of the country was unraveling with frightening speed. That fall, as I covered the campaigns and met with the candidates, I wondered if any of them could unite such a divided nation.
The country, middle America, saw all this money pouring in to the cities and for minorities and to campuses, and riots on campuses, riots in cities, and they said enough is enough.
It was Pat Buchanan, writing for Nixon, who coined the phrase silent majority to refer to those Americans who were fed up with the chaos and ready to stand up for traditional values. The so-called silent majority would be the key to Nixon's chances for victory. But in 1968, there was a wild card in the race who was running strong with those voters. Former Alabama Governor George Wallace.
There's not one dime's worth of difference in the attitude of the National Democratic Party and the National Republican Party.
We're with you, George!
Tom Turnipseed was a young lawyer in South Carolina when he was recruited to be one of Wallace's top aides.
And the Democrat and Republican parties are just like Tweedledee and Tweedledum on these points.
Turnipseed says his grandfather had been a member of the Ku Klux Klan, so he was comfortable with Wallace's segregationist past. He also agreed with Wallace's stand on issues that appealed to blue-collar whites.
Wallace did, I think, have a sincere affinity for working-class people. But the fact that he played the race card and split the working-class folks, black and white, played into the hands of folks that exploit working-class people.
And so Wallace was a clear threat to take states from us and votes from us, and also some votes from Humphrey.
In October, the Humphrey campaign, which had been struggling, suddenly caught fire thanks to a speech Humphrey gave in Salt Lake City. He broke with President Johnson's war policy and called for a halt in the bombing of North Vietnam.
As president, I would stop the bombing of the North as an acceptable risk for peace.
To conclude and bring that war in Southeast Asia to an end, and to do it.
You could see Humphrey was moving up. The enthusiasm was there, the energy was there, the demonstrators had stopped calling him names and started cheering him. He was moving up.
Humphrey made his speech too late, the Salt Lake City speech, which would have turned the entire election in a different direction had it been made 30 days earlier.
From NBC News Election Central,
a special one-hour edition of the news.
On election night, early returns made it clear it would be very close. It wasn't until 3 a.m. that Richard Nixon was able to go to bed reasonably sure that he would be the next president of the United States.
Thank you, thank you.
By the time Nixon claimed victory the next morning, the margin was paper thin, less than 1%.
I saw many signs in this campaign. A teenager held up a sign, "Bring us together." And that will be the great objective of this administration at the outset, to bring the American people together.
The election results foretold the future, and the future was not of a nation united. Combine the states carried by Wallace and Nixon in 1968 and the electoral map, it bears a remarkable resemblance to the red-blue divide of 2004. Democrats had always been able to rely on the solid South. But by 1968, Southern working-class whites deserted the Democratic Party in droves.
These were the Reagan Democrats. This is why they left their party. They were driven out by what those kids and the rioters and the demonstrators and the denunciators were doing in the 1960s. And I think that helped create the great Republican conservative coalition, which won 5 out of 6 elections between 1968 and 1992.
Ironically, Tom Turnipseed, who helped George Wallace capitalize on white resentment in 1968, had a change of heart in the mid-70s. After taking up the legal case of poor blacks who were paying excessive utility bills, Turnipseed rejected his segregationist past and told his wife he was a changed man.
I told her, if we don't do any other thing, let's work for racial justice, because it's just totally important to do that.
Seeking new perspectives was a hallmark of 1968, and at the end of that year, the world would be captivated by the possibility of seeing the planet in an entirely new way. 3 American astronauts were preparing to break free of Earth's gravity and circumnavigate the moon. No one could know if they would ever be seen again. The social and political upheavals of 1968 were not confined to the United States. Student-led rebellions broke out in Paris, Berlin, London, and Mexico City. Just before the riots at the Democratic Convention in Chicago, Russian tanks rolled into Prague and crushed Czechoslovakia's brief flirtation with democracy. The events of 1968 transformed the world in ways we're still trying to understand. As someone who lived through that era,
For the love generation, which is...
I think I now have more perspective than when I was a young journalist trying to make sense of it all.
So here I am back on a corner of the Haight in San Francisco, this time without my tie, but I'm also a grandfather now. In fact, so many of the kids who came here and who were protesting on the campuses, they're grandparents as well, and many of them are members of the establishment. So much of who we are now was set in motion in 1968, and the consequences are complex and uneven. Maybe it is time to have an honest evaluation of what's worth saving and what should be left behind.
There was a dark side and there was a positive side. The people that have romanticized that period, they want to deny the dark side. And how can we learn from history if we don't have an accurate reflection of history?
Watching the progress of the women's movement from '68 is an amazement. I sit here today and we have a woman Speaker of the House. We have a woman running for president, women heads of state in many countries around the world. So some of these things have become so absorbed into the normalcy of the culture that we don't celebrate them anymore.
Let's cut to the chase. They were, relatively speaking, an incredibly spoiled, self-indulgent generation which had been told by many parents, the Dr. Spock generation, that whatever they thought was right.
One of the most lasting things, I think, was that you could be someone, an individual. The 60s made room for outsiders and their ideas.
The doors were definitely opened, and it took a lot of struggle. It took riots on school campuses, it took marches, and all of these struggles. But many of the accomplishments we have now are a result of the 60s.
The 1960s were the first years of the Cultural Revolution and the Culture War in America, which has divided this country and continues to divide it, and which I think we will never overcome, because our disagreements are so deep and profound.
I miss the optimism. It was very optimistic in the 60s.
I think that we're in a bump in the road a lot like 1968. I think we have the war in Iraq that we can't figure out how to bring our soldiers home.
It was never going to be a majority of people who would see the world's possibilities of just getting together and living together in this sort of idyllic peace. Nevertheless, I thought that enough would buy into it so that we could actually begin to relax as human beings and get along. And of course, I was disappointed as time went by, but I'm still hopeful.
For all the disagreements about the legacy of '68 and the conflict that played out during that year, there was one event, often overlooked, that drew us together and says so much about who we were and who we could be.
At this hour here at Cape Kennedy, they still plan to go ahead with it, to send 3 men to the moon and back.
Just before Christmas, the crew of Apollo 8 was about to embark on a risky mission to become the first humans to orbit the moon.
The most unbelievable event in the history of the space program, and one of the most unbelievable in the history of the human race.
The morning of the launch, I said to myself, these people are really serious. We're going to the moon.
Houston, the moon is essentially gray. No color.
On the third day of the mission, astronaut Jim Lovell and his crewmates rounded the far side of the moon. It was Christmas Eve. You remember the first time you saw the Earth from the moon?
Well, it was quite vivid. As we kept on going around, suddenly on the lunar horizon, coming out of the horizon, was the Earth. Really a magnificent sight.
Apollo 8 beamed back the spectacular images the astronauts were seeing, and for the first time, people could see the Earth rising above the moon's horizon. The astronauts expressed their awe in words that resonated with millions. They read from the book of Genesis.
And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas. And God saw that it was good.
I had put my thumb up and hid the Earth behind my thumb. The realization that everything that I'd ever known, everything that of my whole life is behind my thumb. Earth, as you see it from the moon, you realize how fragile it is, how the limited resources we have are, and we all have to live and work together.
They landed safely in the right place at the right time. And the human race, without many victories lately, had one today. And it'll be remembered as long as the human race lasts.
At the end of that tumultuous year, it was possible, if only for a moment, to forget about the strife that had so shaken the country. This one event helped restore the hope that although the world seemed to be coming apart, in fact, it was still together.
For 7 days, the earth and all who inhabit it knew a measure of unity through these brave men.
The one thing I remember is that most of the people that congratulated us on the flight said that you made 1968. You made 1968.
I stepped out of the house and looked up at the moon. A sense of pride, a feeling of satisfaction and achievement came over me. And I thought to myself, is there some American in this great country who cannot, when he sees the moon, not feel the same as I do, and say to himself, we were there.
And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth.